Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Garrity.
And welcome, everyone, to the Monday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Jim Garrity is off today. Kevin Williamson of National Review is in his place. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. And, of course, today is the day our government is officially observing Veterans Day. It was actually yesterday, the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, but there's never too many opportunities to thank our veterans, and it also ties into our first martini today. In fact, it was the crazy martini last Monday when we were talking about Pete Davidson at Saturday Night Live insulting Lieutenant Commander Dan Crenshaw, who at that time was a Republican candidate for Congress in Texas. Now he's a congressman-elect, over the fact simply that he wore an eye patch due to an injury that he suffered while in Afghanistan. The outrage to that led to Crenshaw being invited back to Saturday Night Live and the Weekend Update, where Pete Davidson apologized, and it also led to this moment, and a moment of seriousness after quite a bit of levity from Crenshaw himself.
Okay, but seriously, there's a lot of lessons to learn here. Not just that the left and right can still agree on some things, but also this: Americans can forgive one another. We can remember what brings us together as a country and still see the good in each other. This is Veterans Day weekend, which means that it's a good time for every American to connect with a veteran. Maybe say thanks for your service, but I would actually encourage you to say something else. Tell a veteran, never forget. When you say never forget to a veteran, you are implying that as an American, you are in it with them. Not separated by some imaginary barrier between civilians and veterans, but connected together as grateful fellow Americans who will never forget the sacrifices made by veterans past and present, and never forget those we lost on 9/11, heroes like Pete's father. So I'll just say, Pete, never forget.
Never forget. And that is for both of us.
So, Kevin, it was exactly a week before that Pete Davidson had said he lost his eye in war or whatever. So the forgiveness shown by Crenshaw, the opportunity that created then to really take some serious time to honor our vets turned out to ultimately be a good thing. I wish the first thing hadn't happened, but they turned this into a positive in some ways.
Yeah, I was just thinking when we were going to bring up this subject that the only thing worse than getting a guy who hasn't read a book written since 1970 to talk about popular culture on your podcast is to have him talk about a show that's watched by 11 53-year-old guys in Chicago. But to the extent that they were able to reach that erudite audience, I'm sure it was a good message and all. What this reminded me of a little bit was Book of Mormon, the Broadway musical. As some of you will know, it's a not terribly flattering depiction of Mormons. It's pretty funny. It's the guys who did South Park, and there's a lot of profane stuff in there, and they make fun of Mormon beliefs and kind of Mormon culture and habits and all that. And the Mormons, rather than, organize a protest or, complain that this is some kind of hate speech or something, what they did was they took out an ad in the playbill. And the ad said something like, "You've seen the show, now read the book." And there was an address you could go to get yourself a copy of the Book of Mormon, which I think is the right way to handle that sort of thing. So if you're going to respond to Saturday Night Live, and God knows why you would do that, but some people feel the need to, I suppose. Yeah, go on the show, tell some jokes, be funny, and don't be a ridiculous scold about it. And I think the mention of forgiveness there is probably worth meditating on, because people do at this moment tend to get themselves awfully emotionally spun up about political differences and imagined slights and real slights and tiny slights, or even just sort of, unkind jokes and things like that. What I thought about with his injury also was Donald Trump getting just hell for apparently making fun of that reporter who has some sort of nervous condition where he can't control his arm movements very much, where Trump's doing the press conference and he's like sort of lurching around, making fun of the guy. That was treated as though it were the end of liberal democracy as we know it. And I'm, of course, no great fan of Donald Trump's sense of propriety or decency, but it's sort of a very comparable situation, not a guy who was suffering from an illness, but a guy who took a serious injury in the service of his country. Strangely enough, though, the response from the people who thought Trump was laying down a marker for wickedness and evil didn't seem to feel as strongly about that one.
Yeah, it's amazing how political affiliation, political allegiance sometimes trumps allegiances that should be much, much higher. So
yeah, it's just pure tribalism, which is all our politics is about right now, which is sort of why it's maddening for me as someone who mainly writes about policy questions and social issues, because really all anyone really is animated right now is my side versus their side, black hats and white hats. And this kind of tribalism makes people stupid and also makes the conversation boring, I'm afraid.
Exactly. Yeah, you can't even have a discussion. It's just remember what you said 5 years ago, and it just devolves from there. So
when someone's trying to tell me that cutting the top tax rate from 39% to 34% is racist, I don't get it. The tax rates are the same for everybody. Maybe there's good reasons not to do that. In fact, as you may know, I'm not actually a huge fan of tax cuts when you're running a deficit, but this need to denounce everything as, you're basically the moral equivalent of Hitler is silly.
You're going
trivial.
to kill people. Yes. That's always the bottom line. All right, let's move on to our bad martini now. And Hillary Clinton, we might not be done with her name on a ballot. It was just a couple weeks ago where Terry McAuliffe, a longtime Clinton friend, said we'd never see her name on a ballot again. But apparently a lot of folks close to her think that's not the case, that she will run again in 2020. Here's your colleague Jack Crow reporting on an op-ed that ran in the Wall Street Journal. Hillary Clinton will reinvent herself as a liberal firebrand and mount a third presidential bid in 2020, her longtime advisor Mark Penn predicted in an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal published Monday. Quote, "Get ready for Mrs. Clinton 4.0. More than 30 years in the making, this new version of Mrs. Clinton, when she runs for president in 2020, will come full circle. Back to the universal health care promoting progressive firebrand of 1994, wrote Penn, who co-authored the op-ed with New York City Council President Andrew Stein. The former Secretary of State and twice-failed presidential candidate won't let a little thing like two stunning defeats stand in the way of her claim to the White House. The pair wrote of Clinton's resolve to defeat Trump in 2020. Philippe Reines, another longtime Clinton advisor, made a similar prediction in a Politico op-ed published last month in which he argued Clinton was uniquely well-suited to defeat Trump relative to the more widely discussed 2020 Democratic contenders. Back to Penn and Stein, they say, quote, "She has to decisively win those Iowa caucus goers who have never warmed up to her. They will see her now as a strong, partisan, left-leaning, and all-Democrat, the one with guts, experience, and steely-eyed determination to defeat Mr. Trump." So, Kevin, what makes you roll your eyes harder here? The fact that she's actually perhaps close to joining the 2020 campaign, or the fact that she's going to completely reinvent herself yet again to only build her legacy as someone who will do or say whatever she thinks she needs to win?
It takes a special kind of stupid to describe her as uniquely situated to defeat Trump, because if she were, she would have, defeated Trump, one would think. I once described the Clintons as the penicillin-resistant syphilis of American politics, a line that is frequently plagiarized by Roger Stone, I might point out. And I don't think that Republicans are going to be the ones who are most annoyed by this as Democrats. I think the Democrats are ready for her to go away. They're ready for the Clintons to go away. Certainly in an age of heightened attention to the sexual misdeeds of men in positions of power. You don't really want Bill Clinton standing next to you just too often, or certainly you don't want him standing behind you. I think that would be even probably worse. The palpable desperation around her is the thing I think of as most off-putting. I covered her a little bit on the campaign trail. I followed her around in Iowa for a bit, and she is one of the worst campaigners I've ever seen in my life. And I went out with John Huntsman, who was the other stiff Mormon billionaire in that race. And, she is so desperate for power. She's so willing to go out there and essentially say, tell me what kind of person you want me to be, and I'll be that person. And whatever you want to hear, I'm willing to do it. And I think that, Donald Trump has to be praying she gets into it, because there aren't very many people who took on the presidency as an entry-level job. There's George Washington, pretty much, Dwight Eisenhower. Their first job in politics was the American presidency. Donald Trump was a game show host. And a game show host that Hillary Clinton, who had been Secretary of State and a U.S. Senator and married to a president and all the rest of it, couldn't beat. Couldn't even beat him in states that, should have been hers, theoretically, if you look at the way the numbers historically have broken in a lot of those places. So, Trump has obviously some political skills that are unique to him and his particular genius for marketing and the exploitation of his personal celebrity. But what does Hillary really bring to the table? I mean, she was originally elected to the Senate from New York basically as a tribute to her husband, because in the 90s, Democrats thought they were never going to win another election. And they were so glad to see Clinton come in and kind of defeat and humiliate the Republicans, even turning his impeachment into a kind of victory lap. Mrs. Clinton was elected to this office kind of as a tribute, and then made Secretary of State for no obvious reason in a job that she wasn't actually very good at. Just on any sort of empirical, measurable, objective term, she was not in the top half, I would think, of American Secretaries of State. But still, she will not go away. She is going to be 200 years old by the time this election rolls around, though. And I wish her the best of health, but I think it's time to retire and sit one out.
And Kevin, you've perfectly teed up our crazy martini. Mrs. Clinton is the tip of the iceberg here. Yeah, she'll be in her mid-70s come 2020, although that's pretty much right in the middle of the pack when you think of Joe Biden. He'll be pushing 78. Bernie will be 79. Elizabeth Warren, I think, will be 70. I don't know if Jerry Brown has any designs on running, but he'd be in his 80s. But we've got this whole just parade of people who want to run, from people who have actually won elective office, Cory Booker and Kamala Harris and maybe Amy Klobuchar, to the gadflies like Michael Avenatti. And now we're hearing some other names that hadn't really come up before. And I'm sure I'm leaving a lot out from that previous list.
Beto O'Rourke, people are talking
Beto
about.
O'Rourke, the mayor of
Failing his way forward.
Michael Bloomberg. All sorts of people. Michael Bloomberg, one of your great favorites.
Hey, now, I kind of, I got a soft spot for Michael Bloomberg. What I wrote about Michael Bloomberg at the end of his tenure was that, he's a maddening nanny and a nag and a scold, and New York City's going to miss him like hell when he's gone. I don't think that was wrong.
Yeah, when you compare it to de Blasio, that's for sure. Now we've got Eric Swalwell, who's 37. He's a congressman from California, in case you didn't know. He shows up on cable news sometimes to talk about the Russia investigation and some other things. So he's from the Oakland area. According to Politico, a source close to Swalwell, he's definitely running. He'll be the first potential presidential candidate this past weekend, actually, to visit Iowa after the midterms. Sherrod Brown, who just won a pretty comfortable re-election in Ohio, who would actually be a pretty formidable nominee, is seriously thinking about running it. And even as I look at the Sherrod Brown story, I see on the side, military vet Ojeda announces 2020 run. Normally it's pronounced Ojeda, but in West Virginia it's Ojeda. He lost a congressional race just last week, but State Senator Richard Ojeda filed campaign committee paperwork with the Federal Election Commission on Sunday to run for the presidency. So losses don't matter. Experience doesn't really matter anymore. How big is this field going to get? Is the Republican field from 2016 going to look tiny compared to this thing?
Yeah, not a lot of people jump from the U.S. Senate to the presidency. From the state Senate of West Virginia seems like a little less likely. I was thinking you mentioned Jerry Brown. I'm not an especially young guy. I have a brother who's 2 years older than I am, who's a grandfather. When I was 7 years old, Dead Kennedys came out with a song called California Uber Alles, the first line of which is, "I am Governor Jerry Brown." That was 1979. This guy also, like the Clintons, won't go away. Although I think kind of like Bloomberg, California's going to miss him when he's gone, because he's evolved into the more sensible end of the California political spectrum, as incredible as that is. Yeah, they're going to have an awfully crowded field, I think, because I think they think that Trump is beatable. They think that 2016 was an aberration enabled by the fact that Mrs. Clinton was a uniquely bad candidate, which I think she was, although I think that maybe sells short a little bit about what went into making Trump president. And, if I'm Elizabeth Warren or someone like that, now's your moment, right? Why wait until, say, the next round in 2024 when you might have someone who's a more normal candidate, when you might have had a longer run of economic prosperity and the Republican brand a little time to recover itself, because it is not currently covered in glory, I don't think, although the Democratic Party's brand isn't really so much either. If you're going to do it, why not get into it? And I would jump at the opportunity. I mean, if your worst competition is going to be Mrs. Clinton, who everyone in your party except for people named Clinton is ready to get rid of, and probably some people named Clinton are ready to get rid of her too, to be honest, it seems like the opportune moment. But I can't think of any of these people who are really all that plausible general election candidates. Like, I think Warren, for instance, would be a really tough candidate to beat in the primaries, even though she also was a pretty bad campaigner, someone I've observed up close. She's gotten better at it over the years. But it's hard for me to see her as a real viable candidate outside of people who are already sort of angry partisan Democrats. And I suspect maybe that's the way it's going to go next time around. Whereas in traditionally elections have been everyone runs to the extremes in the primary and then tries to run back to the center for the general election. I think people are probably going to end up this time around running to the extremes for the primary and then more or less staking out that ground, the hope being that you can just bring out enough of your partisans, mobilize your own base sufficiently that's a more winning combination than trying to be a compromise candidate and bringing on more people from the middle as the moderate vote and the unspoken for ideological vote shrinks. It's possibly not going to be a good thing for our politics, although in some ways it might be, because I'd really like the parties just to be honest about who they are. Republicans just come out and say, what we care about is war and tax cuts. And between the two of those, we'll take tax cuts. And the Democrats should come out and say, we're essentially the French Socialist Party. We just don't call ourselves that.
A little honesty in politics. That's asking a lot, Kevin. So
yeah.
I don't know if we'll actually get there. But when you think about Trump running in 2016 as a guy who, as you mentioned before, didn't have political experience, he had a few things going in his favor. Number one, he had instant name ID. Number two, he got tons of free media. Number three, he had a crowded field. So even though he didn't get to 50% of the vote in most states, he ended up winning because the rest of the non-Trump vote was fractured. So if we get a huge Democratic field, which of the more, I don't know if traditional names is the right way to phrase it, but people who actually have some experience in this realm would likely capitalize on that?
If I were putting my own money on it, and I will say this, that I historically don't have a really good record for predicting this sort of thing, so maybe discount that. If I were putting my own money on it, Warren would be the person I'd be most likely to bet on. The one who seems to me the most plausible, responsible president is Garcetti, the mayor of Los Angeles, who actually has some executive experience on his background. It's kind of like being mayor of New York. Being mayor normally isn't much of a qualifying step into national politics, but Los Angeles and New York are such big, complicated places that having been even a reasonably successful mayor in one of those positions, I think is something worth taking into consideration. I know George Will wrote a column about him a while back in which he made that case, and I think that's pretty persuasive. But, the Democrats are crazy right now. They think that we're 2 tweets away from the Third Reich and cattle cars and all that kind of stuff. And, we got people in black masks out terrorizing Tucker Carlson's wife and firebombing Berkeley and that kind of stuff. So who knows where their heads are. I tell you what, I spent an election night in Portland, Oregon. Man, the display of paranoia and vindictiveness and just rank gross tribalism was really, really sobering to watch.
Wow. All I really ask is for all of the races to be called in the midterms before we start the 2020 cycle, but I don't think we're going to get that.
That would be nice, wouldn't it? That would be nice, wouldn't it? Well, Lupe Valdez didn't get too close here in Texas to the governor's race, but Beto came in closer than I think anyone expected him to, certainly closer than I did.
Yeah, and I heard he had quite an effect down ballot in some places too. So
yeah, normally the gubernatorial candidate for governor down here for the Democrats loses by, 30 points. And she only lost by, I think, 15 or 16 or something like that. So way to go. Another moral victory for them.
Yes. Well, you did better than Wendy Davis. If we're having low bars, that's another one the Democrats have cleared. So
man, she's the worst. She's just the worst.
Wow. Yeah, nobody misses her, I don't think. Kevin, great to have you here today. I look forward to the next time. Kevin Williamson of National Review in for Jim Garrity today. Jim will be back tomorrow. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us, and tune in again tomorrow for the next 3 Martini Lunch.